A few years ago, I was talking to one of my cousins, and during the conversation, I casually told her something. I said, I wish I could make spontaneous plans like you, yeah. The kind of a person who just decides on a Friday evening that she is going somewhere over the weekend, or the kind of person who doesn't overthink every little thing, the kind of person who's fun, adventurous, and just enjoys life. I told her, I wish I could be a little more like you. She looked at me for a moment and then said something that completely shook me. She said, Aputai, I learned that from you. And honestly, I laughed at first. But then it hit me. I remember just staring at her blankly because honestly, I didn't know what to say. Somewhere along the way, I had just forgotten that version of myself even existed. The version that made spontaneous plans. The version that loved being around people. The version of me that laughed so easily. The version of me that didn't overthink every little decision. The version of me that actually felt free. And that's when I realized something. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, I've lost myself. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not this one big event where, suddenly you realize you've lost yourself. It's usually 100 small things, 100 small compromises, small adjustments, 100 moments where you tell yourself it's okay. It's not a big deal. Or things like marriage requires sacrifice. I'm sure things will get better. And sometimes they do. They really do. But sometimes, without even realizing it, we stop sacrificing small things and we actually start sacrificing ourselves. The scary part is that most women don't notice it while it's happening because life is busy, there's work, there's family, there are children, there are responsibilities, and then there's the relationship itself, right? And before you know it, years have already passed. Then one day something happens. Maybe a conversation, or maybe you see an old photograph, or you bump into an old friend, maybe a memory, and suddenly you find yourself thinking, how? How did this happen? What happened to me? When did I become this person? When did I stop being me? And if you have ever felt that way, I want you to know that you are not alone. Because over the years, I've spoken to many women who have said almost the same thing in different words. They don't usually say, I've lost myself. What they actually say is, I don't recognize myself anymore. Or that's what I used to be. And that's what I want to talk about today. What they actually say is, I don't recognize myself anymore. And that's what I want to talk about today. The quiet ways, women slowly become strangers to themselves. One thing I've realized over the years is that losing yourself rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels reasonable. It feels like adjustment, or it feels like a compromise. Sometimes it feels like you're being a good partner. It feels like you're keeping the peace. And that's why so many women don't even notice it's happening. Because if someone actually walked up to you and said, you're losing yourself, you would probably disagree. I did. You'd probably say something like, no, I'm just adjusting, or I'm just trying to make this work, or something like, every marriage has challenges. Things will get better, right? And honestly, I told myself the same things too. I remember there was a time when some friends of mine were planning a trip together. Before marriage, this would have been easy. I would have just packed my bags and planned. I love being around people. I love meeting friends. I love doing things spontaneously. But this time was different. This time there were arguments. This time there were discussions. There was so much resistance, tension. And I remember feeling shocked. Not because there was a disagreement. That was not the reason. See, disagreements happen. What shocked me was something else. I remember thinking, how is this happening to me? Not somebody else, me. Because if somebody had described this situation to me a few years earlier, I would have said, no chance. That will never be me. I never imagined I would become someone who would hesitate to meet my friends. I never imagined I would become someone who would have to think 10 times before making a simple plan. I never imagined I would become someone who would slowly start shrinking her own life. Eventually, I said no to the trip because I was just tired. At that time, I also told myself it wasn't a big deal. And that's the thing. Most of these moments don't feel like a big deal when they happen. One missed trip, or one cancelled plan, one friendship that was really close but slowly fades away, one opinion you decide not to share, one dream you put aside for later. Individually, they seem small, but over time, they add up. And before you realize it, you've spent so much time adjusting to everyone else that you've stopped paying attention to yourself. And the difficult part is this: most women don't notice it while it's happening, they generally notice it afterwards. When they look back, when they start joining the dots, when they realize that the person they are today feels very different from the person they used to be. Over the years, both in my own life and in conversations with hundreds of women, I have noticed certain patterns show up again and again. Not dramatic signs, not obvious signs, The kind of signs that quietly slip into your life and become normal. Until one day you realize they've been there all along. So, if you have ever found yourself thinking about something like maybe I don't recognize myself anymore, then see if any of these signs feel familiar. First one of the first signs is surprisingly simple. You just stop asking yourself what you want. Not because you don't have wants, not because you don't have opinions, but because you have become so used to thinking about everyone else that you just stop checking in with yourself. What should we eat? What the children want? Where should we go? Where the husband wants? What should we do? What the entire family wants? At first, it feels like consideration, and it is consideration. But then it becomes a habit. And eventually, you realize that you exactly know what everyone around you wants. But if someone asks you, what do you want? You don't immediately have an answer. I have seen this happen with so many women. Sometimes it's something small. They don't know what movie they want to watch. They don't know what restaurant they want to go to or what they want to do on a Sunday afternoon. Sometimes it also sounds insignificant, but it isn't, because every time you ignore your own preferences, your own voice becomes a little quieter. And after years of doing that, you stop hearing it altogether. The second sign is that you stop trusting yourself. And this one is really subtle because from the outside, everything may look normal. You are still making decisions, you are still functioning, you are still managing your life. But inside, something has changed. You second guess yourself, you overthink, you look for reassurances always. You wonder whether you are overreacting or whether you are being unreasonable, whether you are asking for too much, or sometimes even whether you're imagining things. And slowly, without realizing, you begin treating your own instincts like they can't be trusted. One thing I've noticed is that many women can trust everybody else's judgment before they trust their own. And that's a dangerous place to be in because your intuition doesn't disappear overnight. It gets questioned, it gets ignored, it's dismissed. And that happens again and again and again until eventually you just stop listening to it. Another sign is that you prioritize everyone else's comfort over yours. This one is very common, and many women mistake it for love. You start organizing your life around everybody else's comfort, everybody else's needs, everybody else's moods. If they are happy, you are relaxed. If they are upset, you are anxious. If they are uncomfortable, you immediately start adjusting. And after a while, your own comfort doesn't even enter the conversation. You become the person who keeps the peace. You become the person who understands, the person who adjusts, the person who accommodates. And while there is nothing wrong with caring for people, there is a difference between caring for others and disappearing in the process. Because relationships are supposed to have two people in them, not one person with needs and the other person whose job is to constantly manage them, right? Another sign is that you start feeling guilty whenever you do something for yourself. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because somewhere along the way you started believing that everybody's needs should come before your own. You meet a friend, and instead of enjoying the time, part of you is thinking about everything that's waiting for you at home: the chores, your children, their homework, the family responsibilities, the things that you should be doing. You spend money on yourself and immediately wonder whether money should have gone somewhere else, probably to the house, or maybe for the children, or you know, for something, some family welfare. Maybe you wanted to join a course or a workshop for months: pottery, dancing, or painting, anything. Maybe a course which, you know, something that excites you, upskills you, something that's just for you. But you tell yourself, maybe later. This can wait. Right now, other things are more important. And honestly, sometimes they are. The problem is when later becomes yours. When your dreams, interests, and happiness keep moving further and further down in the priority list. Until one day you realize that everybody else's life has been moving forward and yours has been on hold. Another sign is that you start walking on eggshells. You start thinking before every sentence. You replay conversations in your head before they happen. You carefully choose your words. You avoid certain topics. You avoid certain situations. You avoid anything that might lead to an argument, tension, or disapproval. And after a while, you're no longer speaking freely. You're managing reactions. You're managing moods. You're managing the environment around you. And that's really exhausting because relationships should be a place where you can relax and be yourself, right? Not a place where you're constantly monitoring yourself, not a place where all the time it's tension. One question I often ask women is, can you truly relax when you're with this person? Because when you've been walking on eggshells for a long time, you stop noticing how tense you've become. It just feels normal, right? Another thing is that you start hiding parts of yourself. Now, this doesn't happen instantly, nor is it intentional. In fact, most of the time that happens so slowly that you don't even notice. You stop sharing certain opinions, you stop talking about certain topics, certain dreams, you stop expressing certain needs, you stop showing certain parts of your personality. Not because they've disappeared, but because expressing them feels difficult or sometimes maybe pointless. Like maybe it will create a conflict. So little by little, you become quieter, smaller, and more careful. Maybe not with everyone, maybe with that one person in that relationship. And over time, you start presenting a version of yourself that feels easier, feels safer, more acceptable, less likely to upset anyone, less likely to create conflicts. The problem is that every time you hide a piece of yourself, you move a little further away from who you really are. And eventually you forget how much of yourself has been left behind. Another sign, and this is very, very important for me, you don't recognize yourself anymore. Because by the time you have noticed it, the process has usually been happening for a long time. This is the moment when you look at your life and think, what exactly happened to me? When did I become this person? Not because your life is necessarily falling apart, but because something feels unfamiliar. You look at old photographs, you look at old memories, you remember things, your old friendships, old versions of yourself, and you realize that something has changed. The women I speak to rarely say, I have lost myself. What they usually say is, I don't recognize myself anymore. What they usually say is, I don't recognize myself anymore. And trust me, that sentence carries so much pain because deep down they remember who they used to be. The woman who laughed more, dreamed more, trusted herself more, enjoyed her life more. The woman who felt alive. Maybe you've become so busy surviving that that managing responsibilities, managing relationships, managing life, that you haven't even noticed how much you have changed. Not because you wanted to, but because your focus was on getting through the day, through the week, the month, the year. And somewhere in all that survival, you slowly lost sight of yourself. And somewhere along the way, you became so disconnected from the woman you once were. Not overnight, not because of one decision, but through years of small compromises, adjustments, and postponements. And that's why this sign is so important, because the moment you recognize it, the moment you can honestly say, this isn't who I want to be anymore, something begins to shift. Not because everything suddenly changes, it doesn't, but because you can finally see what has been happening. And awareness is often where rebuilding begins. One of the reasons this topic is so close to my heart is because I hear versions of it all the time. Women rarely come to me and say, Aparna, I've lost myself. That doesn't happen. Almost nobody says that. What they usually say is, I don't know what's happened to me. I'm not what I used to be. I'm not who I used to be. I don't feel like myself anymore. I used to be so confident. I used to have so many friends. I used to enjoy life. I used to really go out there and do things for myself. And as they speak, I can often hear the grief in their voice. Because, see, they are not grieving a relationship, they are grieving a version of themselves. And that's deep. The woman they remember being, the person they miss. And I understand that feeling because there was a time in my own life when I felt disconnected from myself too. Not because I had suddenly changed, but because I had slowly stopped choosing myself, stopped listening to myself. I stopped paying attention to what I needed. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today. Because if you have been feeling this way, I want you to know that trust me, you're not alone. And you're certainly not the only woman asking, where did I go? And there's a good news. The good news is that recognizing it is often the hardest part because you cannot reconnect with yourself if you don't realize you've become disconnected. And maybe rebuilding doesn't start with a big decision. Maybe it starts with a small question. A question many women haven't asked themselves in a long time. What do I want? Not what everyone else wants. Not what everyone else needs. Not what everyone else expects. What do I want? Maybe you don't know the answer immediately, and that's really okay. Many women don't. Maybe you need time to remember, or maybe you need time to reconnect. Maybe you need time to hear your own voice again, and that's completely okay too. Because after years of focusing on everybody else, it can take time to come back to yourself. Sometimes rebuilding starts with something very simple, like maybe calling an old friend and just connecting, taking a walk where you used to go earlier, doing something you really enjoy, like maybe dancing, taking that class you've been postponing for years, listening to music you once loved, giving yourself permission to matter again. That's important. Not because you're becoming selfish, you don't become selfish by starting to live your life, but because somewhere along the way you stopped making space for yourself. And maybe now is the time to slowly start creating that space again. If you have been listening to this episode and finding yourself in some of these signs, I want to leave you with something simple, not a task, not homework, but just a simple question. The next time you're standing in front of a mirror, take a moment and really look at yourself and ask yourself, am I living as the woman who I want to be? Not the woman everybody else wants. Not the woman everyone else wants me to be. Not the woman who keeps adjusting. Not the woman who keeps postponing herself. but me, the real me. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, don't judge yourself. Please. Just be honest with yourself. Because sometimes the first step towards finding yourself again is simply acknowledging that you have been missing for a while. And maybe, just maybe, the woman you have been looking for isn't somewhere out there. Maybe she's waiting for you all along. Until next time, take care of yourself.